So welcome back to our speakers and participants. Thank you to Daniel, Asbjørn, and Youba for these very informative presentations. I'd like to invite our speakers to please turn on your videos and microphones. Our presentations are available on our website, c2g2.net, and on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to look back and share these videos with other interested colleagues, then they're available in English, but also with simultaneous interpretation into Chinese, French, and Spanish. And I've shared the links on the chat earlier. So we hope that making these language versions available will help expand this important conversation. We've already received one question on the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage our participants to please enter your questions if you have more. And while we wait for you to formulate your questions, we've also prepared some questions of our own to get to set the scene and get the ball rolling. So we'd like to start again, like we did in the first instance of this webinar, with a high-level review of what's happening right now with BECCS. We've heard that there's only one pilot at the moment. So we wanted to ask where else pilots are being considered, and where research is happening and how it's being funded. And as with the previous webinar, Dan, if you would like to start us off, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So as Celine mentioned, I think of there as being one full-scale commercial deployment of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration technologies that's in operation right now, and that is at a corn ethanol production facility in central Illinois, so right in the center of the United States. Where we have closely nearby about 200 other of these corn ethanol biorefineries. There also have been demonstrations of carbon capture at waste to energy facilities, particularly in Northern Europe. I think Norway and Sweden, I think, really stand out as early movers in this space as well. And I do generally think that the first place we're going to see these technologies demonstrated and deployed is going to be primarily in the global north, countries like the United States or in Northern Europe, where there is a well-managed biomass supply chain, existing biomass and bioenergy infrastructure, and also suitable geologic storage capacity.
Thanks, Dan. Asbjørn and Youba, did you want to jump in and add something?
Yes, Asbjørn here. I would like to add to Dan a bit more on the Northern Europe situation, because there are no full-scale operations, but there are pilots and there are plans that could make this into full-scale operations by 2025. To just a couple of examples, we have something called Stockholm Exergi, which is a power producer in Stockholm, where they have tried a pilot on using biomass as fuel for power production, and they want to scale up this. And at least the ambition is to have this fully integrated and in part then biomass based. So we have a BECCS chain by 2025. And then I think Dan also mentioned waste incineration. That's also correct. There are also pilots on that, both in Sweden and Norway. So that might be the next step. And I could also add, in terms of industries, you have some energy intensive industries, paper and pulp, for instance, that also are making feasibility studies on this. So things might also come there, but likely later than the two other sectors. Thanks.
Youba, did you want to add something?
The only thing I can add is that there is no pilot plan or operation in Africa.
You read our minds, because I was going to follow up with a question on whether there's any research happening in the developing world, and if not, why not? Would you like to take that, Youba, or shall I?
I think that obviously there is some possibilities of at least realizing part of it, the production of the feedstock. in order to move toward that direction. But it's related to many other issues that have been highlighted during the few presentations. Some of the constant difficulties, the finance issues, and then the competition with, in the context of Africa, how you deal with, try to promote BECCS while people do not have any food security, any food sovereignty, and then water also is a critical issue.
Asbjørn or Dan, did you want to add something to that?
No, just sorry, sorry. Just briefly that I think the key question here is also, as Youba and Dan mentioned, the kind of land issue, because I mean, if you really want to do this at a scale that really makes a difference in terms of the climate, which is the main idea, you need to have this at certain scale. So I think the key bottleneck would be, well, how much biomass or bioenergy can you really produce? Okay, you can start with waste. You can do that at some scale, but if you want to do more than some waste, what is the scale that you can do this sustainably? Because there is competition on land use, and we likely see. I also see a question on that this competition will increase, and that would also over time obviously reduce the potential of producing biomass, because there are all these other purposes of land, and you have both for in terms of human needs, but also in terms of ecosystems, biodiversity, etc. Thanks.
Great, and I'll just say that I think the land issue is absolutely the front and center discussion, especially in developing and emerging economies. I will say that there is a long history of trying to understand what international collaboration on carbon dioxide removal projects could look like, primarily in the forestry sector, through both the clean development mechanism as well as the REDD+ mechanisms. I think that provides a lot of really important lessons for how we can manage our land use sink in the face of a changing climate, and and the related both social and economic issues that arise.
But I'm wondering if we really do have some critical good lessons of REDD+, because that REDD+ was particularly for developing countries, and then that could inform the wide deployment of the BECCS. And I'm not sure also if we have a clear idea of where are the potential areas in the world where there is some possibilities, availability of land, at the same time, availability of water.
Could I add something to that, Celine?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, REDD+, you all know who has been in this game for decades, number of us. We know that this is really difficult issue. And I would say the intention is good with the REDD+, and there are some results, but we also know that this is really difficult to know what difference does this make, and does it really work, and what might be let's call it externalities or unwanted side effects of this. And just one point I wanted to make is that whatever you do in terms of REDD or projects, REDD+ projects, and in terms of biomass production, you need to work with the markets, not against the markets, because one of the really difficulties you have with the REDD projects is that as long as it's more profitable to produce soybeans or beef from cattle and so on, it's really hard, to come with such a mechanism, especially kind of from the outside, and have good results. And because there are always loopholes. So you can, even if you move the production of, let's say, or you have some forest conservation, you might move the production of soybeans or cattle or whatever, or beef, to somewhere else. And it's really hard to to make that efficient, as long as you work against the markets, because it's more profitable to do the other things. So what can you do about that? Thanks.
We heard a bit about this across all three presentations, and to follow our conversation now, can we review how some of the governance challenges for scaling up BECCS should be considered or addressed in the context of current governance processes and mechanisms? Anybody willing to take this question?
I think there is also one critical dimension that have not been directly addressed. This is the equity and ethics dimension. And obviously, if you see many of the poorer countries, there is obviously availability of potential land for, a large-scale deployment of a part of the BECCS. And then those countries are where there is that need of fighting against poverty. Can we use those lands for the BECCS against the food security for those people, against the poverty alleviation for those people? And then those are some of the dimensions I think that we need to seriously consider, and then how it might be part of the conversation, the governance discussion.
Could I also add on that, Celine?
Absolutely.
Youba? I very much agree with you, Youba, that this is the equity dimension. It's not only talking about efficiency, but basically this is about also land use, because you have the local land use, you have the national land use, and I mentioned a lot of soybean production, for instance, and in terms of possible consequences on deforestation or beef production and so on. But you do know that a lot of this is going to the developed countries, right? So again, this is how the international markets work. And they are not terribly concerned about equity issues, I suppose. They are concerned about where you can earn the money. So in my mind, the only thing you can actually efficiently do with this is to have, you need governments to take a stand. You need internationally coordinated policies. Otherwise, you will always, as I kind of implied, fight against the markets and what is more profitable. And consequences can be that that land is used in a way that is not really favoring the local interest and national interest in Africa or Brazil or Indonesia. So you need government interventions and coordinated.
But if I may, because you cannot isolate the BECCS to the other response of the climate, because all has to be considered. That is at global level. And if there is any decision, the decision will not be based on the market. It will be based at the agreement between the different governments, and then to bring all the different set of responses to the climate. Because BECCS is not only the solution, it's part of the solution. One have to look at the other different elements. And then market will work, but market under the condition of the involvement of the government at global level.
But the reason I can just follow up on this, I suppose then I agree on that, but you could just say that kind of, let's say the beef market and soybean market is not really into the climate regime, right? So it's not really coordinated, and if they draw the longest straw, then you have this fight or this challenge. So it's a kind of, I think also the implication is that, and I think you alluded to that, you was that if you go about this too narrowly, it won't work. You have to understand that you have these interactions with the land use, exports, products, exports, imports, and so on. And this affects many, obviously, much more than biomass and that sector. I think this is about how you design a climate policy in the world as it looks like, because climate, there is no market for climate at the start. This is only politically made, right?
Yeah.
You want to add something, Daniel, or shall we move on to the next question?
This is great, but let's move on.
Yeah, okay. So we do have quite a number of questions from our participants, so thank you for that. We'd like to start with a question from Dan Galpern, who asks, does the total CDR potential from BECCS decline with time as more land is required for agriculture, resettlement, and housing due to sea level rise, one of the climate impacts, afforestation requirements, and so on? Perhaps Asbjørn, would you like to start, or?
Yeah, well, actually, I think I alluded to that question a bit earlier, saying that, yeah, I think that's right, because land is a limited resource. Producing biomass for energy or BECCS is only one purpose. You have to produce food. You need to also take care of ecosystems, fibers, etc., etc. So if you use more of the land for these other purposes, there will be less available for producing biomass, at least when it comes to specific production of biomass. Of course, if you're able then to deviate, or what you say, take out some of the production from the other purposes in terms of waste, and you can use the waste for BECCS, that is less problematic. I think also Dan mentioned that. Of course, an implication of that would be that, okay, that's fine, but of course, that will limit or reduce the potential of BECCS.
Dan,
right, and I could add on top of that, just a little bit. I think model results and the integrated assessment models, like the ones used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Obviously, Youba is deeply familiar with them from his time working with Working Group 3 for the Fifth Assessment Report. Some show a kind of a near-term peak and decline of biomass use within the global energy system, while some find that kind of demand for global bioenergy is going to be increasing, likely through the end of the century, and really kind of as long as we can run these models for. And so I think there actually is a lot of uncertainty around understanding what is the ideal role and the use of biomass in carbon dioxide removal. I could see a world where we would ramp up and then decide to ramp down bioenergy with carbon capture as other carbon dioxide removal approaches, ones with fewer side effects but likely higher costs, such as direct air capture, become increasingly scalable or economically profitable. At the same time, I think the availability of sustainable large-scale direct air capture is uncertain, as is future diet demand, food demand, population, yield increases. So many things are uncertain here that I think it would be premature to say, should BECCS peak in 2030, 2040, 2050, 2100, 2200? I have no idea.
I think we have a lot of speculation based on the assumptions of the modeling, and particularly the integrated assessment modeling. And the reality is much more complex and complicated, because we have no idea of the productivity of lands, because that vary from region to region, from different agroecological system to another agroecological system. So that it's very difficult to say that it will decline or it will increase unless we have a clear idea of the productivity of land. Because if you take the context of Africa, for instance, actually, because the agricultural system is expansive system, is not intensification. That means you can increase the productivity of land by reducing the land that is used by for agricultural sector. And so that in that context, how you can say that it will reduce? Because there is a lot of unknown, and then that require further research in order to be able to come up with something that is consistent.
Now I'd like to move on to another question from our participant, Sophia, who asks, to what extent NETs, negative emission technologies, including BECCS, could have a negative effect on necessary emissions reductions in the short term?
I'm happy to jump in on this. I have a particular point of view as someone who's been working on BECCS for probably about the past decade, and watch it kind of, work its way through kind of a technology hype cycle where it seemed tremendously important, and then it would seem tremendously unimportant. And now I think we're starting to really understand that there is a small and incredibly important role for bioenergy and for carbon dioxide removal in the overall approach to climate change mitigation. And what I mean by this, I have no illusions that bioenergy with carbon capture is going to be cheap or easy or immensely scalable to the billions of tons per year. But I, and I would say that anyone who thinks that this is going to be an easy silver bullet solution to climate change needs to take a harder look at the history of deployment of bioenergy systems around the world. At the same time, the opportunity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere by using biomass, the fact that biomass, when it grows, naturally concentrates CO2 from the air, and it is easy to take it from that form and find a way to keep it from going back into the atmosphere, means that it's going to have, again, a small but very important role in climate change mitigation. In a world where we've probably already exceeded our emissions budgets, and it seems very likely that drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere within the next several decades needs to be a part of our climate response. I think, again, small, hard, complicated, and very worth it.
Do you have something to add, Asbjørn or Youba?
That's fine.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
We have a lot of questions, so we can move through quickly.
We can move on.
Yes, exactly. The next one is a bit, it's quite a technical question, and I'm sorry to pick on you, Dan, but I'm going to bring this back to you again. How is H2 production linked to BECCS?
Sure, and I see Roke's question here. And Roke, what I wanted to say, so we actually are very excited about the opportunities to make hydrogen from biomass, and specifically to make carbon negative hydrogen from biomass. The way that it is done, however, is not typically through electrolysis, which involves, it's the way that we operate. We split water by using, by passing a current, through a fuel cell and things like that. What we actually do to produce hydrogen from biomass is through a process known as biomass gasification, which involves heating biomass in a controlled environment to turn it from a solid carbonaceous form into a gaseous carbonaceous form. And then from there, we could process that gas that is produced in order to produce not only hydrogen, but also a pure stream of CO2 that's available for geologic sequestration. So the very rough story here is that biomass contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And when we make hydrogen from biomass, we are essentially separating the hydrogen from the CO2. The good news there is that is about the most carbon negative form of energy you could ever make, because all of the carbon that is in the biomass is available for geologic sequestration. So I think, across Europe, across California, the United States, wherever we're seeing emerging demand and excitement for hydrogen, we're also seeing emerging demand and excitement for biomass gasification as a way of meeting that demand for hydrogen, which of course is a very energy dense and non-carbonaceous fuel.
Great, thanks. And my next question comes from a former colleague of mine, Alexandre, who's now working with the French Water Partnership. He asks, do we have any hindsight on the impact of negative emission technologies, advantages and disadvantages on water resources? Asbjørn, would you have something?
Yes, I can do that. I think in my presentation, I mentioned the study by Smith et al., which I was also involved in. And actually, the demand on water resources can be huge if you make BECCS huge. So in this study, we did some modeling exercises where the target was filling the Paris Agreement target, and the idea also was to check two of these negative emission technologies, namely BECCS and forestation. So what we came up with was that if you really take those IPCC literature review also, and look at, assuming that you could do that. There's no other barriers that of importance, and you do this, do the BECCS really to generate enough negative emissions to meet the target. Then you could end up with using 3% of global water use or availability. So maybe that doesn't sound much, but it's really very much, because we know that already water is scarce in many regions of the world. So it's a sizable share of water resources here, if you want to do BECCS at that big scale.
So we discussed this in an earlier instance of this webinar, but it would be helpful to review how we can govern the scale up of BECCS for the best outcomes in terms of biodiversity and food security. What are the specific actions we know already can be taken? Youba, would you mind?
I think that we have an idea of the technical feasibility. It's not a problem. And then we have an idea also of some of the issues that need to be addressed in terms of institution, social, and then some of the potential concern related to land, to water, to the cost, and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of unknown, and then those need to be looked at seriously. The issue of water, we cannot say at a global level, water is an issue. All is related to the context where it will take place. And then if it takes place there's no scarcity of water, it's not an issue there. And then there is a lot of element we do not have a clear idea where it will take place. And then if we have a clear idea where it will take place, and then so that we can to look at the different other aspects. Technically, it's possible. And then it's part of the solution, because it's in addition to deep mitigation is part of the solution. But there is many other issues we need to look at seriously.
Could I, Celine, could I
Yes,
add something here? Because there's some element I don't think we have talked enough about, and it's related to this issue. How much BECCS can deliver, because it's easy to forget that you have a long chain here. You have to produce the biomass, you have to process this into and transport it, possibly or likely into bioenergy. You have to combust it. You have to then capture the CO2. You have to transport the CO2, and you have to store or sequester or store the CO2. And every step there is a loss. I mean, you have to spend money. That's one thing, but you also use energy, and there are CO2 emissions related to this. So there's actually quite some loss of efficiency along the whole chain, or each step of that chain. And just to illustrate in terms of CO2 capture from, if you have the exhaust combusting biomass, for instance, likely you can only do 90%. You will, because otherwise it will be too costly in energy and money to capture the last 10%. So there's also this efficiency perspective on this, or if you like, maybe call it a kind of life cycle along the chain. So again, you have to realize the kind of total efficiency of this. And of course, as Youba said, it also depends on where you are, what resources do you use, where do you produce the biomass, how much water you use, and so on. But even so, there are losses here, so that makes the efficiency both in CO2 and energy and so on much less than 100%.
So
and I'll just add one last point here. I think what Youba mentioned around understanding the regional context, particularly the regional context around biomass supply and land use, is going to be absolutely essential to understanding the near-term opportunities to deploy these technologies, but also to inform kind of the broader governance issues that will arise as this becomes a more and more of a a billion-ton scale, like gigaton scale climate solution. So I'd like to say that I think that the near-term opportunities that we have to pilot or demonstrate or commercialize these technologies in existing countries with robust biomass supply chains, robust agricultural sectors, as well as kind of robust oil and gas industries, where there's experience with, governing the, CO2 in the subsurface and geologic sequestration of CO2. I think that's going to inform a lot around our understanding of what sustainable implementation of bioenergy with carbon capture could look like. By showing, regional implementations where there is a sustainable source of biomass, a well-governed supply chain, an opportunity for geologic sequestration. Moving past those first few projects, however, I think there are tremendous governance needs, particularly around international trade of biomass and the standards associated with that, that do need to be sorted out before, we can ensure that this is a sustainable or, quite frankly, even a carbon negative solution. And as I mentioned before, I think there are lessons from things like the European Renewable Energy Directive, other experiences with first generation biofuels, even the existing global wood pellet or oil palm trade. These can help us think about, what sustainable BECCS at scale looks like.
Just to follow up on Asbjørn, how he mentioned the long chain of BECCS. Which step or component do you think needs to receive more analytical attention than it is receiving now to better understand potentials for BECCS?
Well, if I may, Celine, if I may, I think definitely it's the first part of this chain. So I would say the production of the biomass, processing this into bioenergy and using this bioenergy or biomass for energy purposes, because there are so many challenges, as we have touched upon a number of these now, in terms of sustainability, potential scale, region, where this is placed in regional terms, and so on, that really determines what are the, or how well does this perform actually in a broader context, as we're talking about here. Whereas I would say that the kind of CCS part, okay, there are some challenges there, but I would say that at least from my perspective, and I've been also working for almost 20 years now, I think, on CCS. We have more experiences there, and and as I see it, there are fewer challenges on the kind of capture part of CO2 and storage part of CO2. Thanks.
So we've also heard that scale-up of BECCS will require significant investment from governments. Where is the private sector getting involved in developing BECCS? And what about engaging in the advocacy for or against the deployment of BECCS? Dan, would you like to take this on?
Sure. So I have a unique vantage point sitting in the state of California, and I think we have some particular opportunities here to pilot kind of commercial scale deployment and with any luck, profitable deployment of bioenergy with carbon capture. And the reason for that is because there is both supportive federal policy within the entire United States that can pay for the geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide, as well as specific state policy that we have in the state of California to produce low carbon or carbon negative transportation fuels, including those from biomass. And that is through something called the state's low carbon fuel standard. So what we're hoping we can do in the state of California now is to really pilot kind of these first of a kind, large scale commercial plants using biomass gasification to produce, again, liquid or gaseous transportation fuels, and through a combination of the policy incentives available both at the state and the federal level, make that a profitable opportunity compared to just using crude oil from a refinery to drive a vehicle in the state of California. I think that the fuel space is going to be really exciting, again, because it looks like both decarbonizing the transportation sector and decarbonizing the industrial sector is going to be harder than decarbonizing the electricity sector. And as governments set more and more policies to specifically drive decarbonization, either in transportation or in industry, I think that BECCS has a really natural place to play here. And and again, that gets to this question of kind of what is the role of governments here. Given the scale of what needs to be done, the amount of resources that need to be brought to this, as Asbjørn made the point really well earlier, working with the private sector, working with markets, and trying to drive them through supportive policy is likely going to be the path forward to actually doing this at scale.
Lid, could I add a bit on that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yes, indeed, the bottleneck is the value of doing BECCS. And it's clear that presently the value is much less the cost of doing this. I think I cited some figures on that in my presentation. So you have to amend that, and of course we can all wait for a higher price on carbon. You never know how fast that price increase might come, and it depends maybe more on the national situation than in the international situation. That will take time, but more realistically, I think what Dan mentioned, that you could have actually introduce a standard saying that if you produce power, or if you produce cement or aluminum or whatever, productions where you have a lot of CO2 emissions, you will need to conform to a standard of lower emissions in the future. So of course you need a gradual develop in that direction. If you're too strict, that will cause problems, of course. If you do that, of course, you can have competition with the other countries that have less control. But then, as you might know, in Europe, for instance, we're talking about this border carbon adjustment, which is actually putting a fee or a tax on imports of, let's say, if you imported aluminum or steel from countries where they have more lax tax or regulation, they have those products there will be a tax added on those products. So that there will be more of a level playing field in, let's say, on the European market on these products. And also there's also one more opportunity here that I find interesting, and that is if you can kind of induce the consumers or the users of the products to pay a bit more for lean carbon or even negative carbon products. For instance, we know that you can produce seen estimates that you produce cement that is more neutral, or where you have fitted the carbon capture and storage. So it's a much smaller emissions at least, and there could also be other technical solutions reducing the CO2 emissions, and that might double then the cost of producing the cement. So the question is, well, can you then induce consumers, both in the public and private sector, to pay a bit more? Because it would be a much more climate-friendly use than of cement in infrastructure, buildings, bridges, etc. The same you could do in terms of waste incineration. That are consumers willing to pay a bit more if you have a close to zero production related to biomass used as part of waste incineration, or even to negative emissions? Are consumers willing to pay for that? Thanks.
Youba, maybe a final word from you before we close, as we're now at the end of our time.
I think that all the stakeholders has to play a role in that. It's not only the private government, even the local communities, because they are much more close to land issues and land use change issues. All those has to play a critical role in that. One have to look at to which extent are they complementary, and I think also one have to look at the one of the sector where there is a win-win option. This is the waste, because waste is a critical issue, waste management from all over the world. If we can turn the waste to BECCS, that will be something that's useful.
Thanks so much for that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It was a very active Q&A session today. Thank you so much to our speakers and our participants for joining us today. Tomorrow, we will be having a webinar on stratospheric aerosol injection on the governance of SAI. So if you would find that interesting, I hope you'll check it out. And we hope to see you all at our next event. Bye.
Okay, thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.